When it comes to video games and horror, nowadays people always talk about those cheap horror knockoffs that try to turn cutie media into nightmare fuel. But if you want actual old school horror, I think Resident Evil was the king of scares, from the first Resident Evil, with its slow and eerie vibe making traversing the Spencer's mansion a nightmare, to the recent Resident Evil Village being more psychological about what a father would go through to just save a family member, yet keeping what made the series so entertaining. Not saying that everything from Resident Evil wasn't perfect. Resident Evil 5 has this mixed reception, and Resident Evil 6 is still considered the worst in the mainline games. And we do not talk about Resident Evil Resistance. But if you ask me what was the worst thing to ever come out of the Resident Evil IP, without a doubt, it's definitely the movies. Believe it or not, there are just as many adaptations of Resident Evil as there are of Sonic the Hedgehog when it comes to home media. And let's just say, a lot of them aren't really good. Whether it be the 3D animated movies, or 2021's Welcome to Raccoon City, which tried to merge both Resident Evil 1 and 2's plot, which is alright at best. But one of, if not, the worst movies to come out of the series came from writer and director Paul W.S. Anderson, which starred Milla Jovovich, who married Paul W.S. Anderson in 2009. Video game adaptations were still not the biggest success, but for some reason, Resident Evil made $1 billion at the box office, even with mediocre scores, to where Hollywood thought they could make the Resident Evil films highly profitable, only for most of these projects to be downright terrible. But you guys asked me to talk about them. Unless you guys really want me to talk about David Pumpkin? Worth a shot. But unfortunately, we have to talk about the Resident Evil movies by Paul W.S. Anderson, starring Milla Jovovich. And as obvious as it sounds, we gotta start with the very first one.
Resident Evil.
Releasing on March 15th of 2002 was Resident Evil the movie. And I know what you're gonna say. You think with it being a movie based off a video game, they would add someone or some place that would make it feel like a Resident Evil movie. Well, yes and no. But mostly no. The movie is all about Milla Jovovich, I mean Alice, where we're introduced to her character as she wakes up with amnesia naked in the shower. And then some army guys and a random guy who just appears go into the Umbrella building in Raccoon City and head straight to an underground laboratory called the Hive. While in the Hive, they actually shut down the supercomputer, known as the Red Queen AI, and let out the undead, who we see perish at the beginning of the movie, and who we now see as zombies halfway through the film. Before we actually get to the major problems with the adaptation here, it should be known that there was actually an intent to adapt the first game into film. A few scripts for the Resident Evil movie were actually made by the following people: Alan B. McElroy, Jamie Blanks, and George A. Romero. Funnily enough, these directors' films were actually the inspiration for Resident Evil. More specifically, the game's director, Shinji Mikami. Unfortunately though, Anderson was chosen to write the film after his box office success that was the Mortal Kombat movie. And for an unfortunate twist of fate, Anderson already had a script in development for a movie he was calling Undead, which he would rework into the Resident Evil movie. This could be one of the biggest reasons why the film has no real connection with the games. That, and also Anderson himself stated the film would not include any tie-ins within the video game series, as he would say, and I quote, "Underperforming movie tie-ins are too common, and Resident Evil, of all games, deserved a good celluloid representation?" What the hell does that even mean? The point of people seeing a Resident Evil movie is to see a Resident Evil movie. As you can probably tell from this interview, he honestly did not care about the source material at the time, and unfortunately it would be like that for the rest of these films. Even if I looked at Resident Evil as his original undead concept, the film itself is incredibly bland. I know I should go into detail about the cast of characters they show in the movie, like angry boss leader, tech guy, angry female, but just like the movie itself, a lot of the concepts are just very uninvesting. I feel like even if I looked at the original concept of the script, it's just a generic horror movie with nothing really investing in it. And that's saying a lot considering one of the most memorable moments of the movie was that hall room with lasers. And this might be me just misremembering this one. Someone actually told me that liquors actually originated in this film, but that's actually not true. They actually appeared in Resident Evil 2 in 1998, and this film came out 4 years later. I should probably continue my thoughts on the movie. After being trapped in the facility with zombies, the remaining cast decided to turn the Red Queen back on, and the reason she locked and killed the employees inside the building is because someone let out the T-Virus, and she locked out most of the facility, probably knowing this would go on as a movie franchise. I also forgot to mention there was also a third random guy who turns out to actually be Alice's husband, who turns out to actually be the one who actually spread the T-Virus. All because Alice was going to give out evidence to prove that Umbrella was a terrible corporation. Not like that really matters because he dies in the end, and adds really nothing to the story. The only people who managed to actually escape from the hive was Alice and that random guy from the beginning, only for them to both be captured by Umbrella, and you see Alice wake up, this time in a hospital nearly naked again. The movie ends with her, now in the zombie-filled Raccoon City, though you don't really see the zombies. Resident Evil was a bad movie. I mean, the film itself is still not entirely bad, and somehow it still garnered some success, making over $1 billion in the box office, and even being nominated for a few awards, though not winning any of them whatsoever. As it still technically has a fan base, and even more crazy, James Cameron even considered this his biggest guilty pleasure. And of course, when it comes to Hollywood, anything that can be considered successful is bound to get a sequel or 6. Unfortunately.
Resident Evil 2.
Released on September 10th of 2004, it's Resident Evil Apocalypse. Taking place right after the first movie, Alice awakes at the Raccoon City Hospital and is on a mission to escape Raccoon City, teaming up with an actual Resident Evil character, Jill Flippin' Valentine, and even rocking the Resident Evil 3 Nemesis design. As this time around, the film was actually a mixture of the plots of Resident Evil 2 and 3, with the story being about escaping Raccoon City before getting nuked, and the inclusion of Nemesis, one of the best and terrifying creatures in the Resident Evil series. Unfortunately, Jill Valentine and Nemesis were the only inclusions from the game so far, though there are characters that looked and were probably planned to originally be from the Resident Evil series, as they do include the Agents of Stars, only for them to get entirely slaughtered. Not to say they didn't add any new characters to the series, as there were yet again a lot of more original characters, such as comedic relief LJ, who, fun fact, was originally going to be played by Snoop Dogg.
Hey y'all, snippety diggity.
Though Paul W.S. Anderson was still the director for this film, there were actually a lot of moments in the movie he actually didn't direct himself, instead giving the reins to Alexander Witt, who was the second unit director. And surprisingly enough, after directing Resident Evil Apocalypse, he found quite a lot of success as a second unit director, filming many box office hits, including all of the 007 films starring Daniel Craig. What's also really interesting is that Alice, Jill, and the others actually have to find a character named Angela Ashford, who for some reason isn't Sherry Birkins. And honestly, with the films getting more confusing, I think that might be a good thing. So they have to find Angela so they can take her to her father, Dr. Charles Ashford, the man who made the T-Virus, only for him to get killed. And it turns out Nemesis is actually Matt Addison. Matt Addison? Oh right, Matt Addison was the guy who was in the first movie that survived, but he actually had a mutated variant of the virus that turned him into Nemesis. And the only reason he was in the film is just so he could find his sister dead in the first one. As there's a final fight, but something, there was some good still in him, and sacrifices himself to save Alice and crew. They survive the explosion, only for Alice to yet again get captured by the Umbrella Corporation. Our hero, ladies and gentlemen, only for her to, quote-unquote, escape the Umbrella building, and then the movie ends. Resident Evil Apocalypse tries to act more like a Resident Evil movie, and honestly, that kind of makes sense considering Resident Evil Apocalypse is surprisingly good. It still does suffer from the major issues of the first film. Even though Paul W.S. Anderson wasn't the director this time around, he was unfortunately still the writer of the franchise, and would do his damnedest to write this series down to the ground. Speaking of underground,
Resident Evil 3.
You know what they always say, third time is always the charm. But in all honesty, when has the third film of a franchise ever been the best? I'll tell you one thing though, it ain't Resident Evil Extinction, which released on September 21st of 2007. Taking place 5 years after Resident Evil 2, the T-Virus has spread all over the world and has caused the planet to decay. And I don't know about you guys, studies nowadays show a lack of humans in the area seem to have the reverse of that effect. And for some reason, Alice decided to leave the group along with most of the surviving cast and try their best to survive the extinction. While that's happening, Umbrella is now cloning Alice in order to replicate a potential cure for the T-Virus, even though at the end of the second movie, they let her go for some reason. Or they're just trying to make weapons of mass destruction to take over the already destroyed world. Also, Alice has psychic powers now. And boy, do I have a lot of problems with this film. More specifically, its continuity. One of those issues is that Jill Valentine, for some reason, wasn't even in this film, instead being replaced by another Resident Evil classic character, Claire Redfield. And they never really explained where she went. Of course, they try to include their own original characters, including the returns of Carlos, one of the male survivors in Resident Evil Apocalypse, and LJ, only to kill them off. This also leads to another problem with these films. Every time they include someone who is or isn't from the Resident Evil series, you get the general idea on whether or not they'll actually stay in the film. This wouldn't be a problem if you're unfamiliar with the games, but considering that this is based off one of Capcom's most successful series that people love, then you have yourself a problem. One of those issues was Angela Ashford, the little kid from the last movie, who was removed from the movie series altogether, whether because they didn't want to add her to the story, people didn't like her, or so she could be replaced with a girl literally named Kmart. Because, I'm not joking when I say this, that's where they found her. Resident Evil Extinction is where the series definitely goes off the rails, and I don't mean that in a positive light, as the film has a baffling amount of continuity problems and shows how flawed this movie franchise truly is. And it's when we get through Afterlife when shit truly hits the fan.
Resident Evil 4.
What people have regarded one of, if not the all-time worst Resident Evil movie, Resident Evil Afterlife, released on September 10th of 2010, taking place a little after Resident Evil Apocalypse. As at the end of Apocalypse, Alice fights a tyrant and manages to find an army of clones of herself, and with her clone army, infiltrate Umbrella HQ in Japan and take on its leader, Albert Wesker, Resident Evil's main antagonist throughout the mainline games. And this film has probably the most over-the-top action and green screen you'll ever see in the franchise. Though Wesker blows up the facility, killing all but the original Alice, and a good chunk of Japan, Wesker apparently makes a serum that removes Alice's psychic abilities, making her human, and they somehow both survive their plane crashing into a mountain. Later down the line, she reunites with Claire Redfield, who now has amnesia for some reason, and they fly a plane to Los Angeles and find a safe place from the zombies, who for some reason now have the Las Plaga parasite from Resident Evil 4. The action sequences in this film are just so over-the-top dumb and mindless to where they come across more hysterical than serious. Most of those action sequences coming from Alice herself, who I should remind you is human again, and also has a gun that shoots quarters. Talk about a money shot. There's also a lot of script issues within the movie, such as apparently this taking place 4 years after Apocalypse, even though Extinction said it's been 5 years. And then Alice says it's been 6 months since she last saw Claire, meaning it took Alice less than 6 months to infiltrate Umbrella Japan, find a working plane, and fly all the way to Alaska. Not to mention, Kmart might be one of the most unnecessary characters in the Resident Evil series, so much so that she was written out of the movies entirely, though that might have to do with her actress not wanting to return to the films. Also, at the end of the movie, Jill Valentine is evil now. Wait, what? I know they haven't added her in many of the recent films, but why is she evil? It might have something to do with Resident Evil 5 or 6, but if I'm gonna be honest, I've never really played those games. Even with all its issues, Afterlife is still considered one of the worst Resident Evil movies according to critics, but in my opinion, even with all its issues, comes across as the most enjoyable in the series, goes around to being hilarious. Unfortunately, I came back to my senses as the rest of the films just keep on getting worse from here.
Resident Evil 5.
These last two films, in my general opinion, might be the worst in the Resident Evil series. Starting, of course, with Resident Evil Retribution, and I'm genuinely surprised they actually made it this far to a fifth film. Releasing September 14th in 2002. As the movie literally starts with events we are about to see, but in reverse. And then Alice does her recap spiel, as she's been doing throughout most of these films, looking like she's in a Zoom call with someone. And besides the Hive, the second underground base in Extinction, and I guess you could consider the boat at the end of the last movie an underground base, Alice is captured again and is put in yet another underground base within these films. With this secret underground base being one of the biggest, as it's a facility used to demonstrate chemical warfare, such as the T-Virus. Helping her on her journey this time being Ada Wong and Albert Wesker? I'll let that one slide for now, because after so many adaptations, we finally get a theatrical version of Leon S. Motherfucking Kennedy, helping out on this rescue mission to save Alice, along with another original character, Luther, who was one of the few original characters that actually survived from the last movie, a couple of nobodies, and Barry Burton? Just gonna say, that is a definite out of nowhere choice, especially how they treat him in this movie, as I generally have a lot of issues with this movie altogether. First problem, Albert Wesker is a good guy? It's Albert Wesker. Clearly, he is not helping Alice without it benefiting him in some way. Issue 2. You have Barry Burton, who for some reason is good pals with Leon, even though I don't think they've actually met in-game, but knows Jill Valentine, as they were in the same team in Stars along with Chris and Wesker, and they do nothing with that interaction whatsoever. And they have the balls to kill him off. He had a family, people! A family! Issue 3. One of the major selling points of this film was that they brought back some of the original characters from the previous films back from the dead. Why even bring back most of these guys? Was Rain really a fan favorite character? Carlos, I guess, which also leads to issue 5. How did they get DNA of these guys? Were they supposed to give blood as part of their application? Did they scrap up some of their corpses and rebuild them? Which would be impossible since the hive is on lockdown, so they couldn't even get Rain's body parts, even if they tried. And last I checked, Carlos blew himself up like Chaozu. But if you want my biggest problem with this franchise altogether, is the inclusion of all these original characters that, in all honesty, we shouldn't even care about. The reason being that most, if not every character they add into this series are either killed off or removed from the film entirely. The only person we know won't die in these awful films is Milla Jovovich's character Alice, because her character has one of the worst story elements if not done correctly. Because she's supposed to be this awesome character who manages to get herself kidnapped 3 times throughout this entire franchise, who does actually kick ass in some moments, but also acts like a total idiot in a lot of other situations. And I'm just gonna be honest, Milla Jovovich isn't a great actor, as I really don't like her performance in any of these films. I have nothing against her as a person, she's probably really nice in real life, but I really don't like that how she has to solve everyone's problems throughout the entire Resident Evil series instead of the main characters of the Resident Evil games. You can even find that issue within the movie itself, as we find that there's a kid who happens to be the child of a clone that was part of this facility, adding more continuity issues right there. They blow up the facility, but Evil Jill and Rain survive, and they have one more action fight, but long story short, Rain kills Luther by punching him so hard his heart stops. I am not joking. They save Jill Valentine, who happens to turn good, and Rain is killed off for good this time. I really hate Resident Evil Retribution. It adds absolutely nothing to the franchise, and in my general opinion is the literal definition of member berries, as it's trying to make you remember that these characters were important, but that's not entirely true. They added nothing to the series whatsoever and are completely uninvesting characters. And unfortunately, the last film in the series does not even end off on a high note. So let's get this over with.
Resident Evil 6.
We're finally here. After 5 years of waiting and ending this franchise once and for all, it's Resident Evil The Final Chapter, which released in the late January of 2017. And at this point, I honestly don't care, as the movie begins with how the reason the T-Virus came to be, as a man named James Marcus made the T-Virus secure his daughter, who looks like Alice for some reason. Probably isn't important. And we see the horrific side effects of the T-Virus, and instead of shutting down the project like an actual person with common sense, a man named Alexander Isaacs kills him and takes over Umbrella. And at the end of Retribution, we actually see all of our Resident Evil protagonists from Wesker, Ada, Jill, and Alice about ready to have a big old battle against all the zombies within the Resident Evil series. But they skipped all of that, and it turns out Wesker never actually gave Alice her powers back. because this was all in fact a confusing plan to lead Alice and most of the Resident Evil cast to the White House, only for all of them to be potentially killed off within the franchise. So Ada, Leon, Barry, Jill, Alice's child clone, all potentially dead. Way to show your love for the source material, people. Another one of the big issues I have with the later parts of these movies, more specifically from the end of Afterlife to the beginning of the final chapter, these movies always end with these epic confrontations about to begin in the next movie, only for them to never actually show that awesome confrontation. It's like if Avengers Infinity War literally ended right when the aliens dropped on Wakanda, only for Endgame to begin with Thanos wiping out half of existence. Because why show off the coolest parts of the movie, only to never actually do it? But after surviving the attack against the White House and a zombie dragon, which is called a Kipepeo, the Red Queen returns, messaging Alice that there was an antivirus for the T-Virus the entire time, and it's back at the Hive from the very first movie. So that means that, you guessed it, Alice has to infiltrate yet another underground facility, and to make it even more annoying, it's the very first one. And she only has 2 days to do that. And with the help of Clara Redfield, who I guess got her memories back and probably lost her brother, along with other original characters that are obviously going to die. Will they end Umbrella and the zombie apocalypse once and for all? What do you think? You're probably wondering, who the hell is Alexander Isaacs? And why does he look so familiar? Well, that's because he was that tyrant final boss in the end of Resident Evil Extinction, even though his name was J. Isaacs. And to make things even more confusing, there is a third Isaacs chasing Alice throughout the entire movie. They also have a plot twist bad guy, but considering what movie this is, it's painfully obvious who it is. Even Milla Jovovich herself says why it's so obvious.
You're still alive.
If you're curious why it took 5 years to make this movie, it was because Anderson was still busy with another film he was making called Pompeii, and Milla was pregnant in 2015, so you could understand why they pushed back the film. But at long last, we can finally end this franchise once and for all. As when we get to the facility, Alice goes to that laser room that we see time and time again to the point where I'm sick of seeing it, and we finally reach the depths of the Hive they never showed in the first movie, and comes face to face with the real Alexander Isaacs, who unironically has the antivirus. We also meet Alicia Marcus, the daughter of James Marcus, who is the second owner of the Umbrella Corporation, and is actually the original, as Alice, in truth, is a clone of Alicia. Also, Alexander has cybernetics, because at this point, I've just kind of accepted it.
Nanomachine, son.
They have their final fight, Albert Wesker goes out like a bitch, Alex kills Alex, good luck figuring that one out, and finally releases the antivirus onto the surface, ending the zombie apocalypse at last. And considering that Alice also has the T-virus within her, killing Alice as... I'm sorry, I couldn't say that with a straight face. No, Alice gets to live, as it only killed the T-virus inside her body. She also says that the antivirus hasn't affected the entire planet just yet, and the franchise finally ends with Alice driving off on her motorcycle, being chased by more of those zombie dragons, even though they should be dead due to the antivirus. And at last, the final Resident Evil movie by Paul W.S. Anderson, starring Milla Jovovich. And boy, am I glad I can finally stop watching these movies. I guess if you're a fan of this movie franchise, it's an alright swan song. But for me and probably other Resident Evil fans, this was nothing more than a fan fiction by Paul W.S. Anderson about a girl named Alice in the Resident Evil universe, and how she was the one to destinally save everyone from the zombie apocalypse. I know I've skipped a few things about this franchise. That's because it can get frustratingly annoying to try to understand this entire plot. So if you couldn't understand this entire movie plot, here's the entire Alice story rundown. Alice is actually a clone of Alicia, who was the daughter of James Marcus, the man who made the T-virus, in order to cure his daughter. Alice was made as a bodyguard for Umbrella's secret underground facility in Raccoon City called the Hive, but decided to betray Umbrella by giving the research of the T-virus to Lisa Addison. But Alice's husband, Spence, sees her betrayal and releases the T-virus within the facility, only for both him and Alice to lose their memories. Alice wakes up and runs into Umbrella soldiers and Matt Addison, Lisa's brother, and get inside the Hive to shut down the Red Queen, an AI based off young Alicia. But in doing so, release the T-virus into Raccoon City. Alice and Matt escape, but are captured by Umbrella and were tested with the T-virus on them. This led to Alice's DNA merging with the virus, giving her psychic powers. So Umbrella captures her, only to let her go, thinking with her DNA was more than enough to replicate the anomaly within her. 5 years later, the tests were unsuccessful, so they decided to find Alice again and try to capture her again after most of the planet is wiped out due to the zombie outbreak. Alice destroys the underground facility and releases all her clones and heads to Umbrella's underground base in Japan to destroy it, only for Albert Wesker to destroy the facility with most of her clones. But the original Alice sneaks into his ship, and Wesker removes the T-virus from Alice to make her human. Though she no longer has her psychic abilities, she still manages to survive the zombie outbreak and another Umbrella ambush, where they capture her again and place her in another underground base. She manages to escape with the help of other characters from the Resident Evil series. Wesker gives her powers back, but in truth didn't really, and Alice has to return to the Hive so they can obtain the antivirus for the T-virus. So it's a race against the clock where she spends most of her time wasting it getting to Raccoon City, helping Claire Redfield protect some randos, and then sneak into the locked up underground facility where she now realizes she doesn't have any memories of what happened before the first movie, and that's because she meets the real Alice, making our Alice the fake Alice along with the AI Alice. In the end, Alice was the only person who did anything that mattered in the entire franchise, and not the actual faces of the Resident Evil films, because Alice is that awesome of a character. You get all that? I think you can probably understand now why I have gripes with this franchise. More specifically, how he made Milla Jovovich into this awesome character within this universe of Resident Evil, instead of making something that actually felt like a Resident Evil movie. You could probably enjoy it for being its own original thing, but the problem being it's not original, it's based off a popular IP. And of course, he had the balls to try that again with the Monster Hunter franchise. I might not be the biggest fanatic of the Monster Hunter series, but even I found this insulting to the source material. There is usually a right or wrong way to adapt certain material. But luckily now we live in an era where video game adaptations actually can be good. But if you're also genuinely curious on what I thought of these films, obviously the best one was a Resident Evil Apocalypse, followed by the first Resident Evil for being just okay. I still say Afterlife was still pretty enjoyable for how bad it was. Extinction was just a meh movie, with the final chapter and Retribution being the worst the franchise has to offer. This has been the AngelStar, and hey, it could have been worse. He could have made a Capcom cinematic universe starring Milla Jovovich. Other than that, happy Halloween, everybody.